So welcome to lesson 2 of Positivity Bias, stories to reframe our experiences during these turbulent times. Tonight, we're going to be talking about developing a good eye. I want to start tonight with a story of Rabbi Yohanan ben Zakai. He's this great Talmudic sage and leader. He once sends his students out into the world to discover the best advice for living a righteous and fulfilling life. When his student Rabbi Eliezer ben Horkanus returned from his travels, he says, Rabbi Yohanan, I want to tell you what I discovered. I have searched and I have found that the best advice is to develop an ayin tov, a good eye. When your lens on life is good, what you see is going to be good. Everything you see, your entire perspective on life is going to be good. As the saying goes, what we see depends on what we look for. What we see depends on what we look for. The Rebbe once spoke about a Jew who was going to work on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year. And all of a sudden, he remembers that it's Yom Kippur, that it's the holiest day of the year, and he makes his way to the synagogue for just a few minutes before he goes to work. The Rebbe says, look at this Jew. What compels him or her to come to synagogue for 3 minutes? What compels them? It's their soul. And the Rebbe continued saying that the time that they're in the synagogue, they are there and not elsewhere. And that itself deserves a tremendous merit. My gosh, I mean, that is such a different perspective than so many other rabbis who tend to focus on what people don't do, on the mitzvah or the tradition or whatever people are not doing, not on what they are doing. A disciple from a neighboring Hasidic community once visited the Rebbe. And this disciple requests a blessing. And after discussing his personal issue, this particular Hasid asked a question that he had heard. He says to the Rebbe that the Talmud at the end of Tractate Chagiga says the following, that even the sinners of Israel are filled with good deeds as a pomegranate is filled with seeds. Now, he says, Rebbe, isn't this statement contradictory? If someone is truly a sinner of Israel, how can the Talmud say that they're full of good deeds? The Rebbe closed his eyes and he nodded and he began to cry. He looks up at the man and he says, I have a question on the very same passage. If the Jew we speak of is truly full of good deeds, how can he be called a sinner of Israel? I think here's a classic example of two individuals looking at an identical text, but seeing something vastly different. What becomes clear from this story is not just the spiritual state of the Jews under discussion in the Talmud, but also the mind state of the people having the discussion itself. Because each one is choosing what they want to focus their attention on. Do we want to focus our attention on the negative, or do we want to focus our attention on the positive? We're all going to be biased in some way. Remember last week we started off by talking about the newspaper reporter. The Rebbe told him that everyone is biased. We all have a bias. The question we have to continue to ask ourselves every single day. And now that we've dedicated the next hour to this, we have to ask it today because this is the time that we have given to it. So we have to look deep within our soul deep within our psyche, deep within ourselves, and ask the question, what is my bias? When I judge others, or even when I judge myself, am I actively looking to empathize, positivity, or the opposite? And I think that it's up to each and every one of us to decide, what is my bias? And it's okay. You can say, look, I've been conditioned a certain way. This is how I like to live my life. And stop, Rabbi, you have all these great ideas, but, and I know that you mean well, and I know that you're very well intentioned, but really, I think the time has come to, you're always talking about this positivity, but there's a reality to life. It can't always be positive. I'm going to share my screen with you for a moment. And I want to show you a picture. And the picture that I'm going to show you, I would like you to write in the comments. You can either write them in your comments here. You can either write for everyone or just for me. You can do it just for me if you don't want to do it publicly, or for everyone. You may have seen this picture before, and if you have, that's fine. I want you to write, what do you see? What do you see in the picture that I'm showing you here? Take a moment, look at it. Did everybody write something? So this is a picture that was shared on the internet a number of years ago, probably around 10 years ago. And what was amazing to me is there's actually two pictures here. One is a picture of, I guess we'd call her an elderly woman. And the other one is actually a picture of a young woman. If you only see the elderly woman, try to find the youthful woman there. If you only see the youthful woman, try to find the elderly woman. Do you see now the two pictures? Look at her. You'll find there's another person there. There's two people in this picture. If you're having trouble finding it, I'll send this to you after the class. I'll put it as part of my package that I send you as the post-class package, so you can spend some more time focusing on it. What my point is here, and why I showed you this picture, is that each of us see things through our own perspective. That's just the reality of our lives. And we're not capable of seeing how others see things in any other way. So many of us say, well, I didn't see the other way. And that's usually what happens. We don't see the other way. And I think this is a great experiential lesson on how deeply attached we are to our own bias, how we're so deeply attached to our own subjective view. Researchers have found that the social standing and the expectations of subjects predicted which of the images they saw first, the young figure or the old figure. In other words, what they saw was directly impacted by a projection of what they were looking for. Just think about this a second. what they saw was directly impacted by a projection of what they were looking for. That's shocking. If you look now at my screen, I've just shared an image that was taken off of Honey. If you don't know what Honey is, you probably haven't been on Facebook very long. Honey is Humans of New York, and probably one of the most popular Facebook pages. It's a guy who was actually out of work, didn't know what to do with himself, and he went and took pictures of people, and he would write up a little caption, a little story. It actually became a really popular social media tool that people still use. Now, I do it myself sometimes. I take a picture of a person and I'll write a little caption. So this is from June 6, 2014. You can see this picture of two men sitting on a park bench. And the caption says, "We're eye doctors. What's something about the eye that most people don't realize?" I'm assuming this is what this photographer asked them. And they answer, "The eye doesn't see. The brain sees. The eye just transmits. So what we see isn't only determined by what comes through the eyes. What we see is affected by our memories, our feelings, and by what we've seen before." In other words, what we see is directly affected by our default lens, by our bias, for better or for worse. Everything we see is directly affected by our bias. And therefore, I think it's of paramount importance to work on developing the capacity to see God, to see the good in everything. This is the essence of what we're calling tonight a good eye. And I think this is the foundation of an interpersonal positivity bias. When we view the world in such a way, then we're going to tend to find positive interpretations of events, of experience. And we're going to be able to start judging people in a favorable light. Every human being possesses the capacity for redemptive vision. But to achieve it, to maintain it, requires a tremendous effort. And maybe we find it feasible to see the good in someone neutral. But how do we recast? How do we redeem someone who has made their negative pretension or their intolerance clear? How do we do it? I think about it so much. When I wrote this course, there weren't riots going on in the world. There weren't protests going on. Right now, the world is listening to the Black community in a way that I don't think we have listened before. I can tell you, I know that I always said I'm a visible minority, and I am a visible minority because of the way I look with my kippah and my beard, but nothing compared to a Black man. I was talking to one of my neighbors here who happens to be African American, a wonderful man, a good friend. And he said, if I'm driving, this is what he told me today, if I'm driving and a police officer doesn't stop me, I consider it a good day. He said, sometimes I'll be walking down the street. He's a working man, a good citizen. He said he'll be walking down the street. He will see a police officer and he will check his pockets to make sure he has nothing incriminating, because the odds are that he's probably going to be stopped if he's walking in the street. We have a bias because the way that we look at the world. We have a bias because of the lens through which our experience. I don't have the experience of a Black man. I never will. I can sympathize. I can try to empathize, but I don't know, and I'll never know. And right now, it's become clear to me, and I think clear to so many of us, that this is a community whose voice has not been heard, and they have been trying to be heard for so long. And the only way that they've been able to be heard is by peaceful protest. I'm not talking about the looting. Nobody's gonna, that was taken away from the point. I'm talking about people who are peacefully protesting, who want their voices heard. And one of the things that I've realized in the process of me checking my own bias, of me checking my racist bias, is that perhaps I have a lens through which I've looked at the world that doesn't allow me to truly understand the plight of an African American or a Black person. And that's really important because the kids are being homeschooled now. So Sarah and I decided that we have a great opportunity to teach the kids things that perhaps they didn't have an opportunity to learn in school, or maybe they'll never have an opportunity to learn in school. So we got all these books for kids on racism. And the conversation in our home over the past couple of days has been about racism. And we spoke about the Underground Railroad and just giving them the history of Blacks in America and Blacks in Canada, and just so the kids don't know. And I know that, I don't know about our generation, but what we can do is we can educate the next generation. That's a really, really important thing that we can do today. And I came across a fascinating children's book. I was just really looking for racism books. And this kind of popped up on Amazon. I bought probably, 6 or 7 racism books. And this one right here popped up on Amazon. And it's called Love Yourself, Love Each Other. And I'm going to read you. It's by a man named Jeffrey A. Davis. He's an African-American man. It says that he's an author and a community leader and activist in the New York Democratic Committee member, district leader in Brooklyn. He's the father of 3. He has a master's degree from Long Island. Then he goes through a whole entire bio on this guy. Listen to I'm not going to have time to read the book. And if you want, maybe I'll read the book later on. But I'm just going to read you the back of the book. It says, Love Yourself, Love Each Other is the first edition of the Love Yourself book series. The story is based on a time period within the lives of Jeffrey A. Davis and his brother, Brooklyn Councilman James E. Davis, and their encounter with Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson outside their home on Brooklyn Avenue in Crown Heights, Brooklyn. You can see very clearly on the cover of the book, there's 2 African-American boys and a rabbi that looks like with a hat and a white beard in the background. It's just fascinating, written by an African-American man. So I went and did a little research to find out what is the background. I had to buy the book, obviously. And then I wanted to find out what was the background on this story. And I found an interview that I want to share with you. I hope this comes off.
Then I went again, I said the spiritual direction, and the Manager was like, precious and important roles in family systems. Mr. Jeffrey Davis is a community activist in New York. In 1990, he founded the Love Yourself, Stop the Violence Foundation, together with his brother, Councilman James E. Davis, who was later murdered in New York City Hall.
Roughly 1975 to 1982, 83, 84. We were roughly 10 years old, my brother and I. James E. Davis, he went on to be the councilman in Crown Heights. So we say Councilman James E. Davis. As children, we played catch in front of our home on Brooklyn Avenue, between Eastern Parkway and Union Street. We played catch, as children do. And a nice, friendly man used to walk by. He lived a block away from us. He lived on President Street. And he used to walk past our home, coming from the synagogue, coming from fellowshipping, coming from worshiping. And he used to talk to us. We embraced him because he embraced us. There were times when he used to come by where we looked forward to him coming by because he gave us money. Like this. So he says, here's $1 for you, and here's $1 for you. And of course, as children, I'm looking to see how much my brother had. You got more dollars than me. And then he like said, these two children. So he got a chance to get to know us. And as he saw us in the community, and we saw him, because on Brooklyn Avenue was a small block. So there's no children on the block. And we got a chance to communicate with this wonderful, wonderful person. Our whole life, career-wise, has been because of a lot of teachings that he taught us, a lot of things that he said, a lot of kind things that he said. And one time he specifically said, my brother and I was arguing over the ball, and he came over and said, behave yourself, love your brother as you love yourself, and love yourself as you love your brother, because you're each one. So love yourself like this. Initially, that happened when we were 10, 11, 12 years old. And as it turned out, 20 years later, that was the name of our organization, Love Yourself, Stop the Violence. Later on, I found out he's the Grand Rebbe. He's the Grand Rebbe, the Grand Rebbe. And I see his picture everywhere. And as I see his picture, I just reflect. Of course, we have his picture in our home. Not as the Grand Rebbe, but as a friend. Somebody who inspired us, somebody who talked to us, somebody who gave us good advice, somebody who took a liking to two children. So when I speak of him, I reflect about someone who was, I would give him 75, 80 years old at the time, maybe a little older, that used to talk to us, that didn't look like us, but opened the door for us to communicate and to embrace all human beings.
Sorry. I think that it's really easy for us to be able to say that we don't have a bias and we don't look at other people as different. We don't look at it as Hispanic and say it's Hispanic or Chinese or African American or whoever they are. It's so easy for us to look at the world that way and say that I don't have a bias. But the truth is that we only have the lens through which we look at the world. We don't have anything else. And because of that, it's practically impossible for us to know if we're truly non-racist or not, or if we're truly non-biased. And I think that this is the call of the hour. Something that, again, I didn't plan this because I planned this course before all this started. But this is our opportunity to be part of the collective voice of this world and ask ourselves, are we part of the problem or are we part of the solution? We may find it feasible to see the good in someone neutral, but how do we recast? How do we redeem somebody who we don't see as neutral? So for almost 2 decades, there was a man by the name of Levi Yitzchak Frieden. He was the person who took the pictures. So people would come to the Rebbe on a Sunday to get $1, and many of them wanted a picture of that experience. Both Sarah and I have pictures from our moment with the Rebbe. And he would stand there right behind the Rebbe taking pictures. Now in 1976, he held an exhibit called 770. And it was at the Tel Aviv Journalist Center, Beit Sokolov, and then Bar-Ilan University. These exhibits gave a wide range of what he called unaffiliated Jews, their first look at the Rebbe and the spirit and the reverence and the joy of Jewish spiritual life. The exhibit was very well received, but one journalist commented sharply in the guest book of the exhibit. The journalist wrote that with all due respect to the superb photography, the subject you have chosen is extremely clerical and takes us back to the primitive darkness of the Middle Ages. This photographer returns to the United States, and he presents the Rebbe with the guest book. The Rebbe leafs through it quickly, and he notices the negative remark. And the Rebbe turns to the journalist and says, please compliment the journalist on his strength of character. It takes fortitude, the Rebbe said, to differ from all the other responders. And then the Rebbe continued a further positive spin, and he says, tell him also that not everything in the Middle Ages was dark. The Rebbe wanted to make sure to spin a positive spin on everything, even the Middle Ages, which in many respects was completely unpleasant for our people. But that was the Rebbe's vision, that was the Rebbe's goal, and the Rebbe, being the Rebbe, had to accentuate that. Because if we're going to get a little bit of that, the Rebbe had to do a lot of that. There's another story about this guy named Shelley Bear. He says that he was in yeshiva, he was in a Jewish school on Belmont Avenue in Brooklyn. And right before his 10th birthday, his mother and his babysitter went to see the Rebbe. And they went to 770, he says, and my mother began to talk to the Rebbe. And she was saying that my son Shalom, referring to this Shelley, has been thrown out of all the yeshivas, and his teachers say that he's not listening, and the rabbis are complaining, and he doesn't like the school and the homework and the program, and he likes eating stuff in class, and she's going on and on. And the mother's crying because she was searching for answers. I mean, it was a real situation. The kid was not doing well in school. So he says, the Rebbe turned to me, the 10-year-old, and he says, come here. I started the conversation, he says. I was ready. I said to the Rebbe, somewhat provocatively, you're the Rebbe? The Rebbe looks at me with a big smile and he asks me, are you a good boy? He says, no. I was ready. I was used to the scene. I came prepared for the challenge. The Rebbe then said, do you like school? So I answered, no. Do you listen to your mother? No. And with a big smile, the Rebbe turned to my mother and said, emes. He tells the truth. He tells the truth. It's good. He concludes and he says, that was the moment that pulled me right back onto the path. So here's a rebellious child who's looking for a good fight. And then all of a sudden, all of that resistance melts away at the moment that he encountered someone who saw him, who saw in him the innocence, not insolence, the truth behind the tirade, someone who defined him by his divine soul rather than his defiant spirit. When we're lovingly shown our essential goodness and our inner truth, we begin seeing the same in ourselves, and then we begin to act on it. So think for a second. Think of someone who's having a hard time, someone who their acting bothers you, it disturbs you. What possible reason they may be acting out of the way they are? Can you see past their facade? Can you see past the arrogance? Can you see past the narcissism, past the self-absorption? Can you see into their wholesome essence? Can you see that their wholesome essence is in need of nurturing, of tender love and care? Remember, if you change the way you look at people, the people you look at will change. I'll say that again, if you want to write it down. If you change the way you look at people, the people that you look at will change. In 1960, Yale Butler was a son of one of the leading Orthodox rabbis in Pittsburgh. And he had developed this personal relationship with a Chabad rabbi. His name was Rabbi Spielman. And so this young Yale, he's an individualist, he's creative, and he's in the 7th grade. He becomes the editor of the school newspaper, and he wanted his first edition of the school newspaper in 7th grade to attract attention throughout the Pittsburgh community. So he thought of a spoof. One of the more active figures in Pittsburgh's Jewish community was a Chabad rabbi who wore an army hat and jacket. And this, in his untrimmed beard reminded him of Fidel Castro. Actually, the association was so common that this guy was nicknamed Castro throughout the community. So obviously the real Fidel Castro is totalitarian, anti-American. I mean, everyone knew about it at the time. So Yale decided to expand on the caricature, the visual association between the rabbi and the dictator. And he wrote a fictional account about the invasion of Cuba, which Castro's troops were in danger of being wiped out. In desperation, Castro calls for his brethren in 770 in Chabad World Headquarters. And they contact the Rebbe, and the order is given. Hasidim were to march on the Brooklyn Navy Yard, commandeer several submarines, and sail to Castro's rescue. This is this 12-year-old's version of this fictionist story. And oh, did it attract attention, but not the kind that he desired. So many read his article, but obviously few approved of it. And even as that it was in jest, it was out of place. And leaders of the traditional Orthodox establishment, they reprimanded the 12-year-old for his lack of sensitivity. And they wanted him to apologize to the Chabad community. Obviously, the first issue of his newspaper was the final one. But when he went to this Rabbi Spielman, who he knew, who was Chabad, and he asked him for forgiveness, he didn't reprimand him. He said, I want you to come meet the Rebbe in New York. Yale was willing, and Rabbi Spielman arranged for a private audience between this 12-year-old who mocked the Chabad community and the Rebbe. It's Sunday evening. Yale and Rabbi Spielman enter the Rebbe's room. The Rebbe motions for Yale to sit down. And he noticed Rabbi Spielman leaving. Now, at this point, he says he became very nervous. A 7th grader sitting alone with the Rebbe. The Rebbe spoke to Yale warmly, telling him that he knew his family and he knew of their work on behalf of the Jewish community in Pittsburgh, and Yale was moved. The Rebbe continued complimenting him for his talent as a writer. Now, Yale says, up until this point, I had been mesmerized by the Rebbe's eyes. But then I noticed a copy of the article that I had written on the Rebbe's desk. But he says the Rebbe made no mention of the article. He spoke of a person's obligation to see his talents as a trust, meant to be used for the benefit of others. In particular, the Rebbe emphasized a writer should use their abilities to promote Jewish unity and love towards one another. So this Yale began to relax. His feelings of fear turned into feelings of empowerment. And instead of reproaching him for his disrespectful story, the Rebbe had recognized his potential. And he encouraged him to develop it. And he gave him a positive and productive focus for the future. As 1982, this Yale became the publisher of the B'nai B'rith newspaper. And with that, he said that he was able to truly carry a Jewish narrative. And he made sure there was always a Devar Torah, some Torah in the paper, and he would use Rabbi Schneerson, the Rebbe's Torah. And he actually would be sending the Rebbe the paper each week without charge. But the Rebbe had felt the need to subscribe on his own accord and pay for it with his own personal check. And years later, the Rebbe remarked in a conversation that this Yale, who's now actually Rabbi Butler, had shown a unique skill as a writer since childhood. I think that when I read this story, I noticed that the Rebbe's positivity bias allowed him to see through the veneer of youthful chaos, of youthful rebellion into the boundless potential for spiritual accomplishment, waiting to be identified, waiting to be activated. To the Rebbe, it's all about developing a positivity eye. And that positivity eye also develops what we say. It develops so much part of our words. So much of the damage in our personal and in our professional lives comes from the words. The Rebbe, for example, wouldn't use the word deadline. Instead, the Rebbe would use the word due date. The Rebbe didn't use the word retreat because in the Rebbe's playbook, the only direction was forward, was upward, was onward. He didn't use the word undertake because undertake implies an association with death. You can say, I undertake something, meaning not to give yourself over to something fully. What I mean, it's as simple as just looking for the positive in every person. The Rebbe believed that love is the answer. And I've been thinking about this in connection with racism, in connection with the Black community. I think that hating someone who hates doesn't make you someone who loves. And for us, love is the answer. We need to be people who love. And yeah, you can have difficult conversation. But before you have a difficult conversation with someone who you know is not going to agree with you, make sure that you think of the dignity of the other person. There's actually something called the peak end rule. There's a guy named Daniel Kahneman, and he writes about that. He suggests that the way that we process an experience very often is by the end. So, for example, he says, if you go to a concert and there's 89 minutes of brilliant music, and the last minute, there's this screech because the sound system went off, it will forever be the concert where you remember the screech. And the same is with interactions. The same is with relationships. The same is with encounters. The same is with experiences. The Rebbe would teach, always ensure that the ending is positive and illuminated. Sometimes you need to have a robust and rigorous conversation, and it's not all pleasant. There's actually a beautiful example of an emotionally charged conversation that the Rebbe had with someone. I'm not going to talk about the conversation itself. You can read Positivity Bias, which was the book that I'm basing this course on, Rabbi Kalmanson's book. It was a tense conversation. And just before the woman left the conversation, before she left the meeting, the Rebbe says to her, I'd like you to smile. She's shocked at the request that she just bursts into a smile. And the Rebbe says, it's so important to me that when someone leaves this room, when someone leaves my study, they leave with a goodness of heart. And so I think it's important. It's an important point that if we need to convey something that's unpleasant, if we need to convey something that's difficult, we have to do so with dignity. And whatever interaction they might be, it should be something positive and constructive in the end. And there's so many examples of this throughout the Rebbe's writings. You know, the Rebbe dealt with very serious issues. People think that the Rebbe was this feel-good rabbi. He wasn't a feel-good rabbi. He dealt with very rigorous and conscientiously charged issues, with evil, with negativity. And he was able to navigate that tension and actually ensure that despite that difficulty of the content of a conversation, it was always conveyed with dignity, with respect. And that's why even the Rebbe's detractors looked at him with tremendous respect and admiration, because you can't hate someone who loves you. We need to be the lovers, not the haters. So, sometimes it's true, as a parent, as a spouse, as a teacher, you have to sometimes lay down the law. You have to say it as it is. But that's what's within that law. Is there love? Is there light? If there is, we, the human spirit, we're master detectives, and we're going to resonate with that love. I really think that the world experiencing this social unrest, the protesting, the rioting. Today, I have so many interactions with people, and they're constantly about the state of affairs of the world. They say, we're leaving our children with a world that's worse off than that we inherited. You know, somebody once asked the Rebbe, if you could choose any period in history to live in, which would it be? You know what the Rebbe said? This one. He was a tremendous proponent that the arc of history bends forward. And even if you can't always see it, and he talked about our era being the one preceding the Messianic, the Mashiach, that we're at the threshold, and he actually pointed out to cultural trends and to news items and to current affairs very often, and he linked them to biblical prophecies. He demonstrated how the world is literally becoming more messianic, as it were. Now, this is something that maybe decades ago you would have said was in the realm of wishful thinking. But today, we have writers like Steven Pinker, and you have writers like Hans Rosling, who wrote that book, Factfulness. And there's so many other books like that. I mean, actually, Bill Gates last year was invited to Time magazine. They had the 90, it was like a special anniversary edition of some sort. I don't remember the details of it. But in the 94-year history of the magazine, they never invited someone external in. And he was the editor of this magazine that came out last January. And the entire theme of the publication of this Time edition was positivity and optimism. And he invited the world's greatest thinkers, the world's greatest experts on the topic, to write a synopsis of the tremendous advances in the world. And as he put it, when exactly are you meant to report on the statistics that are taking place over decades? So you're, of course, going to read in the news about negative thinking. For example, did you know that 40 million planes landed safely last year? Did that make it to the news? No. You only know about the 3 that didn't. Did you know that poverty in the world is at an all-time low? That life expectancy is getting higher? That we have higher education rates? All these major metrics. The world is at an unprecedented good place. Yuval Harari, he puts it somewhat jokingly, I don't know exactly, but he says more people today die from eating too much than die from eating too little. I mean, it's sad, but more people today die from suicide than from homicide. If you say that you study the data, remember, we pride ourselves on being a data-driven society. Follow the data. We live in incredible times. And for us, it's important that we sensitize ourselves to the positivity going on around us and to amplify that and to share it. Share the positive message. Today, we're fighting a negativity bias. We have a real negativity bias. I mean, in the 60s, we learned that you get a lot of power by fighting injustice, by fighting negativity. So if there's injustice and it gets improved over time, then what do? If there's not as much injustice to fight, then you have to learn new dance steps. Remember, I said this before, hating someone who hates doesn't make you someone who loves. There's still a negativity bias. And the more negativity I can find, the more money I can raise, the more ratings I get, the more I'll get from the government, the more attention I get from the media. So we are really up against a negativity bias that's super lucrative. The Rebbe wasn't denying that. The Rebbe wasn't ignoring the negativity. He wasn't out to lunch. He didn't live in denial. The Rebbe confronted it by activating the positive, by activating the light. As the Rebbe would so famously say, a little point of light dispels a lot of darkness. I mean, 5% of the Canadian population thinks the world is getting better. In America, which is far more optimistic, the number is 6%. I think we need to reevaluate We need to talk about what's really going on. We have to see that there's a true positivity going on in the world, and we don't have to give in to the negativity bias. And there's an important little matter I want to just conclude with tonight. And then we'll go on to our discussion and our questions and answers. And that's negative self-talk. Someone once came to the Rebbe and started complaining about himself. And the Rebbe said to him with a smile, I have yet to see a religious source that allows lashon hara, evil talk, spoken about oneself. Meaning the same way Judaism doesn't allow evil talk about another, the same way Judaism doesn't let us speak negatively about someone else, Judaism does not allow us to speak negatively about ourselves. And how often do we say, I'm so silly, I'm so stupid. Oh, why did I do that? I'm such a this or I'm such a that. We have to get rid of the negative self-talk. And you're going to see, once you get rid of it, that slowly and surely you're going to recalibrate. You're going to condition yourself to see yourself in an empowering way. You're literally the tempo, the fabric, that of your existence is going to become much more positive. The Rebbe would say that the way you change this world is one person, one day, one mitzvah at a time. We need to think positive thoughts. And right now, the world needs a lot of healing. And how is the world going to heal? It's going to begin with us, with you and me, deciding that we're going to look at the world around us. And instead of trying to find the negative in ourselves, instead of trying to find the negative in others, which is so easy because we have been conditioned that way, we're going to recondition ourselves to see the positive in ourselves and others. Ourselves first, and then once we see the positive in ourselves, we can see the positive in others. Because if we don't see the positive in ourselves, we can't even begin to see the positive in others. And that is how we're going to change the world. L'chaim.